When my daughters and I went to the local shop here, we found these magnificent cherries. They were so delicious. Some were super sweet and juicy, and some had this bittersweet taste. Absolutely delicious. It was so lovely. When we went back, they were all sold out. Luckily, I took some photos before we ate them all. What I did was I used my grandmother's little blue plate. It's in fact quite small. It's a tiny little one. I would say it's about 10 centimeters, but I made the picture quite big so that I can have enough area to paint. I don't like to paint tiny little things necessarily all the time, so I made it quite big. So this little piece of paper is the Chinoiserie watercolor paper, and it's about, I would say, 25 centimeters by 30 centimeters. And the colors I used were perylene maroon with alizarin crimson. I also added a drop of quinacridone rose. I love that color. It just changed the whole concept of all the layers that you build, and some of it shine through a lot of the top layers that you add over the quinacridone rose. So you can also mix in a little bit of Payne's Grey, but I thought that the French ultramarine mixture is a beautiful color to mix for the darker tonal values that I used on the cherry. So in certain areas I only used the perylene maroon, like on this cherry that I'm painting now, and on the others I mixed in a lot of the alizarin crimson. I wanted a lot of texture on these cherries, and you will see that I layer and layer each color. However, I must admit I used the Chinoiserie cold press watercolor paper, and I have never painted a detailed painting on the Chinoiserie watercolor paper, so for me it was a learning curve, so I had to adjust the way I paint. I found that eventually the paper just got saturated. I couldn't add any more layers of watercolor, which I love to use, or I love to paint in a lot of detail on certain parts of my paintings. For the painting of Tyson, this paper is absolutely perfect. However, if you want to add a lot of detail, like I mentioned, this paper I really battled with, so I couldn't add all of the tiny little details, especially the water little droplets. For me, it was just slightly difficult or different to use. There's nothing wrong with this paper, it's just that it's new to me, and I would paint with them again in the future. I will just have to adjust the way I paint, but I would love to paint it again on the Arches or Fabriano hot press watercolor paper, or even the Chinoiserie hot press watercolor paper, which I bought a whole book of this, or block of this Chinoiserie hot press watercolor paper as well. I just find that for the Chinoiserie hot press watercolor paper, you also can't scrub too much on the paper. So like for instance with the Arches, you can scrub a little bit on the paper. You just have to be careful with the Chinoiserie watercolor paper. I also found that for me, just trying to neaten up the sides of the cherries was a little bit difficult on this paper, because it had a little bit more texture than what I am used to. So I want a little bit more of the French ultramarine mixture in the perylene maroon and alizarin crimson red mixture, just to darken some of the tonal values on my cherry. And then I use my lovely little Kum number 5 memory brush, one of my favorite brushes. I use it all the time. And then for the darker little shadowy parts on the edges of the cherries, I used a lot more of the French ultramarine mixture to help the cherry look a little bit more rounded and to create the shape of this cherry. So I still follow the shape of the cherry, try to keep it as 3D or 2D as possible, whichever you prefer. I don't want it just to be flat on the paper. And what I love about this little kumeme brush, it has a nice stiff little point, so it's much easier to use around little markings, especially around the stems of the cherry, so I could neaten it. So I really love to paint this on the Arches hot press watercolor paper, or the Fabriano, or even the Honey Mule. So this is currently on my tiny little plate palette. I wanted to keep all the colors in one place, so I decided to use one of these tiny little plates, and then I could just move around on to whichever color I wanted. So sometimes I will use a little bit more of the light pink, red, alizarin, crimson color, and then sometimes I would like a little bit more of the French ultramarine dark blue purple mixture. So I can just move around on the palette to which color I want to add on certain parts of the cherry. I still want to keep most of the highlighted little sections as light as possible. I need a very tiny little brush, and this one is the Prime Art little brush that I found locally here. So any little tiny brush with a nice point will do. So I want to paint this little water droplet. I rinsed all of these cherries like I mentioned, and I've put them on this plate, and then I took loads of photos. So there's always water droplets in most of my paintings. I love to paint water droplets. And slowly I'm just creating a lot of texture on these little cherries, especially this one. And if you want to see any more of these little videos, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can follow me on Instagram. I've got a little link in the beginning of the video. I will also add it in the description below. So for this, I'm using the dark mixture just to create that darker shadowy part that you can see on the bottom of this cherry, and that's the colors that we are looking for on that piece of paper. Trying to create the 3D effect on this little cherry. Lots of water droplets on this one. Trying to soften those little hard lines, and now I'm going to leave that to dry. The full tutorial will be available on Patreon. I supply a whole booklet to use as reference. I want to make it easier for all the students so that they can use this little booklet as reference while they paint. They just follow along and follow each progress photo to make it easier. This is a block of Honey Mule watercolor paper that I've used, and I don't have to stretch it. And for the blue of this plate, I just used the French ultramarine, and when I wanted to darken certain sections I just added a little bit more of the purple mixture, just a drop, or you can use a little bit of Payne's grey. Certain parts I had to darken, so I just mixed in a little bit more of the purple mixture and I used a thicker consistency. A little bit more French ultramarine, and then I finished all the tiny little detail on these little flowery parts on the plate. You're welcome to follow me on Instagram, and if you would like to see more of these videos on YouTube, please subscribe to my channel, and I would appreciate it if you give it a thumbs up. Thank you for watching, and see you soon with my next painting.